Yes, Mr. President.
Thank you, my Lord. My Lord, when we looked at the website, when we did the record, we were concerned about the quality of the photos of the post-mortem that you can find at the archives in this regard. And we tried to enhance those photographs. I used Mrs. Madeleine Fuller of the Missing Person Task Team, and she helped me to enhance those photographs, and we compiled an album just to help us with those. And I asked that it be accepted as C7, my Lord. I've given copies to all the parties, and you've got the best copies of those photographs that we have, my Lord, C7. I've also asked her to help us with the TRC request, my Lord. She worked at the TRC, so she's presently busy with the request of the TRC, my Lord.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, my Lord.
I just want to find out from Advocate Kutse. You have probably seen the heads of argument that were submitted by Mr. Thompson yesterday.
I didn't need to.
Yes, a few instructions to join in that application.
But all the situation between my client and his client is different in the sense that Mr. Els did not testify in the regional inquest. And that I can see from the summary in the judgment where the magistrate summarizes the evidence.
Yes.
It does not appear that he has testified. That makes it different from his situation whereby his witness has previously fully testified and his record is not available.
Yes.
And as such, my client, if called upon, will have to testify as he's a witness. If the court calls him, he must come to court.
Yes.
And he does not have that concerns as to having previously testified.
Okay. Thank you. I just wanted to know that so that, because it may impact on the program as we go forward.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Vanya.
Thank you, my Lord. Before we call our first witness today, Dr. Shakira Holland, we'd also like to take care of some paperwork and hand up certain affidavits and documents.
Yes.
We have quite a few documents to hand up. I wonder whether I shouldn't hand up the bundle now so that as we go through them you'll have them in front of you.
Mm-hmm. Have you marked these documents?
My Lord, the first two documents are just administrative operational documents. The first one is a revised list of exhibits.
Yes.
Obviously in a draft dynamic form, which was changed over time. And the second document is a revised list of witnesses, which may also change over time.
Yes.
In terms of the exhibits, the first document is the curriculum vitae for Dr. Shakira Holland. My Lord, we have marked that as C5. The second document is the curriculum vitae of Dr. Steve R. Naidu. That includes a summary and the full CV for Dr. Naidu. We've marked that document as C6.
Yes.
The next document is an affidavit. It's the affidavit of Farouk Dindar. And we decided to add that affidavit to volume H. And we have marked it as H5.
H4, yes.
The next affidavit is that of Gaja Chotia. provisionally mark that affidavit as H6.
Yes.
And the final affidavit is that of Frank Kenyon Dutton, and that affidavit is marked H7.
Yes.
My Lord, I can confirm that all the parties have been furnished copies of these documents.
Yeah. Thank you.
My Lord, with your leave, I'd like to call Dr. Shakira Holland to the stand.
Yes.
Your full name and surname?
Shakira Holland.
Do you have any objection in taking the oath?
I have no objections.
Do you say that the evidence that you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please raise your right hand and say so help me God.
So help me God.
Thank you. You may be seated.
Thank you, my Lord.
Yes, proceed.
Dr. Holland, firstly, we greatly appreciate you taking time out of your exceedingly busy schedule to be with us this morning. Dr. Holland, I understand that you have prepared a report on the instructions of the legal representatives for the Timol family. Is that report titled Review of Postmortem Report on Body 3911/71?
That is correct.
And do you have a copy of that report with you?
I do.
My Lord, for the record, that report is contained in volume C at page 135.
If you placed before her the curriculum vitae
Yes.
for her to confirm, you need not go through all of it, but just to confirm the qualification.
Yes,
Expertise.
that right now.
Yes.
Dr. Holland, you've provided us with a copy of your curriculum vitae. It's titled Curriculum Vitae Shakira Holland. You confirm that this is your CV?
That's correct.
I would just like you to highlight a few relevant matters from your CV. Can you describe your current position and what you do?
Currently, I'm a senior specialist. I'm based at the Forensic Pathology Services, Gauteng, and a lecturer at the University of the Witwatersrand in forensic pathology.
And have you been doing that particular work since the 1st of January 2008?
That is correct.
And in terms of, we had to come up with a job description for you. You conduct medico-legal investigations of unnatural deaths. Could you set out a few of the activities that you would typically do?
So the investigation of medico-legal unnatural deaths involves, firstly, attendance at scenes of deaths and history, relevant history, conducting of the post-mortem examination, which includes the autopsy and relevant special investigations, compiling of the post-mortem report and analysis of the special investigations as part of the report, and attending court.
And you've also had a history of reviewing and providing medical legal opinions in inquest dockets.
That's correct. That is part of our service delivery obligations.
And you also juggle an academic career at the same time?
That is correct. Because we are a joint appointment with the university at the Witwatersrand, we are involved with undergraduate training for the medical students and law students, and postgraduate training for all our doctors that work in our service, including our registrars, and those are doctors that are studying to become specialists in the field.
It is of some interest to us, particularly as lawyers here, that I see from your CV that from 2006 to the present day, you have been teaching forensic medicine for lawyers.
That's correct.
And you've also been giving practical autopsy demonstrations to law students, medical students, and police personnel.
That's correct.
Doctor, approximately how many postmortems have you conducted?
Approximately 4,000 to 5,000.
Between 4,000 and 5,000.
That's correct.
Doctor, can you explain to the court how you prepared yourself in order to prepare your report and what documents you might have examined?
My Lord, I was asked to give an opinion on the post-mortem report that was conducted on the deceased on the original date of death, which was in 1971. I received the original post-mortem report that was done by Dr. Skeppers, and I also got the post-mortem photographs that were taken as part of the report. In addition, I went to the Wits Archive Library and I obtained the reports from Dr. Gluckman, who was an independent forensic pathologist that was asked to give an opinion on the case. So I obtained the histology report from Dr. Gluckman that was done on the slides that were taken at the time of the post-mortem examination. So once I had all those documents, I then reviewed all the findings in those documents to be able to compile this report and make an opinion on the findings.
Thank you, Doctor. Doctor, before we ask you to take us through your report, you use certain medical terminology, and perhaps you can unpack those words for us in layperson's terms. In particular, three terms: abrasions, bruises, and contusions. If you could just describe to the court what you mean by those three words.
Okay, so abrasions, contusions, and lacerations, and bruises. They are the 4 types of wounds that we see as a result of blunt force trauma. A bruise is where a blunt force has impacted the body, resulting in the rupture of the blood vessels just under the skin. When we see what is the equivalent of a bruise on the internal organs, we call it a contusion. A laceration is another wound that results when a blunt force has impacted the body, and this is essentially a tear in the skin. An abrasion is another form of wound that is caused from blunt force impact, and this is where the superficial surface of the skin has been scraped away as a result of contact with a blunt force.
Thank you, Doctor. Doctor, is it so that certain injuries that are described in the post-mortem report are not visible on the photographs?
That is correct.
So, for example, contusions on the inside of the lip wouldn't be visible on the photograph. And as you take us through your report, perhaps you can indicate the significant injuries that are visible and those that are not. Doctor, before we...
Just before you proceed, Doctor, when counsel puts something to you to confirm,
Yes.
just say so verbally.
Yes,
Don't just nod your head.
Sure, I was just waiting for him to finish his whole statement.
Just say so verbally so that the transcript should reflect that you are nodding in approval.
Yes.
Yes, proceed.
As a quick reason. So, Dr. Holland, before we get to the specific conclusions that you have drawn on the basis of your study, in your report you have set out quite a large number of findings as a result of your review. I don't necessarily want you to take us through every single finding, but could you take us through what you would regard as your most significant findings?
I will do so.
Thank you.
So, my Lord, if I can just explain, I think it's quite important to be able to explain the external findings as was documented in the original post-mortem report, to give you a picture of exactly what was found on the body before I go into the discussion, because it will help to understand the discussion once we get there. I'd like to start on the first page in paragraph 1.1 that documents the external findings. There is a note written that where possible, the wounds are labelled on the photographs that were taken at the time of the post-mortem examination. As was stated previously, some of the wounds, we cannot see them on the photographs. It could be that they were not photographed, they weren't actually photographed, or the photographs are not of a good quality to show the wounds. In point 1, there is a fracture of the right elbow. Point 2, there is a fracture of the midshaft of the right femur. So the right femur is the thigh bone. There is a subcutaneous hemorrhage over the lateral aspect of the left foot. A subcutaneous hemorrhage just means a hemorrhage under the skin, and it was on the left foot. The next point documents all the bruising that was found on the body. In point number 1, that is labelled on the post-mortem photograph, it indicated that there were 2 big bruises of the right side of the forehead, just under the right eyebrow, and 5 centimeters above the right eyebrow. The next few bruises we are not able to see on the photographs, document facial bruising and bruising to the right side of the neck and the right side of the shoulder, as well as in the in both infraclavicular areas. So these are the areas above the collarbone. Okay. In point number 2, which is illustrated on the photographs, there's a comment that there are a few bruises of the anterior right upper arm. And there's a large bruise of the lateral aspect of the right elbow and the right forearm close to the elbow, which cannot be seen on the photographs. There are further bruises on the back of the right forearm, which again cannot be identified on the photograph. On the photograph on page number 2, item number 3, documents a few bruises on the right side of the chest. The next indicates a bruise of the right iliac crest, which is not documented on the photographs. So the right iliac crest would be the groin area. The next point is 2 big bruises of the lateral aspect of the right thigh, which are not identifiable, and then a big bruise of the medial and posterior aspects of the right knee, which is also not identifiable. The next point indicates that there was a big bruise at the back of the right lower leg, and the underlying muscles of the calf are contused, which is also not in the photographs. There was fresh bruising of the mucosa of the left upper lip. So the mucosa is the inner surface of the upper lip. A bruise of the left supraclavicular area situated 3 centimeters above the middle of the clavicle again. So the clavicle is the collarbone, so this is above the clavicle. A bruise of the left shoulder tip, so at the back area on the top there was a bruise of the left shoulder tip, and multiple bruises of the anterolateral aspect of the left upper arm and the left side of the chest, and this is indicated in the photographs. There was a big bruise of the anterior left wrist, which is not indicated on the photographs. There was bruising over the dorsal surface of the left hand and of the first finger of the left hand. So the dorsal surface basically means the back of the hand. A bruise of the left groin, which is identifiable, number 5. A big bruise of the left lower leg and ankle, which is not identifiable. A bruise of the dorsal aspect of the left foot and dorsal aspects of the second, third, and fourth toes. So again, the dorsal aspect is the part of the foot that is not touching the ground, so the opposite to that. A 5 centimeter diameter bruise of the left posterior chest near the inferior border of the scapula, and that is identifiable in point number 6 on the photographs. Bruises of the left posterior chest, which is not identifiable. Bruises of the left buttock, which is not identifiable. And then bruises of the left posterior thigh, which is shown in point number 7 on the photographs. Further, there are bruises of the left lower leg near the popliteal fossa, which is the area behind the knee, which are not identifiable. So that, my lord, is all the bruises that were described in the post-mortem examination. The next category of injuries are the abrasions that were identified.
Doctor, can I just suggest that as you turn pages, you indicate that you're doing so?
I will do so.
We're currently on
page number 5
of your report, and that's 139 of the record.
Okay, so the next group of injuries will document the abrasions that were found on the post-mortem examination. The first point indicates 2 scratches, approximately 1 millimeter wide and 5 millimeter long, scratches of the middle of the forehead and just to the right of the center of the forehead. So a scratch is a similar wound to an abrasion where the superficial surface of the epidermis has been scratched away, but it is linear in nature. And it's not on photographs. The next point is a few scratches of the right side of the neck, which are identifiable in the photographs as point number 8. The next point is a few abrasions of the front and top of the right shoulder, which is identifiable as point number 9. A small abrasion with scab formation over the middle third of the right clavicular area, which is identified as point number 10. A linear abrasion of the lateral aspect of the right elbow and the right forearm close to the elbow, which is not identifiable. A few abrasions of the back of the right forearm, which is not identifiable, and multiple small round abrasions over the lateral aspect of the right iliac bone, which is not identifiable. Again, this would be in the groin area. I'm now on page number 6. The next point indicates that there is an abrasion with scab formation of the right scapula, which is shown on the photographs. A few irregular abrasions of the right lower back, also shown on the photographs as point number 12. There is a fresh abrasion of the left upper lip, which is not identifiable. A small abrasion with scab formation of the left lateral neck, situated 3 centimeters below the earlobe, which is identifiable as point number 13 on the photographs. A 2.5 centimeter by 4 millimeter abrasion with scab formation of the left forearm, which is not identifiable. I'm going on now to page number 7. So, my lord, those were the external findings, and so that documented significant bruising and abrasions and contusions on the body, as well as fractures of the limbs. On page number 7, we're now starting with the documentation of the internal organ findings. In the first point, 1.2, the skull and scalp, says that there are extensive scalp hematomas of the frontal areas bilaterally extending to the lower forehead. These are essentially bruises that can be seen on the inside of the scalp. So when we do a post-mortem examination, we reflect the scalp forwards, and we're able to identify the bruising that may not be seen necessarily from the outside. So the frontal areas are, may I indicate on this, is really just the front of the forehead. This is similar with the scalp hematoma of the left occipital area, which is the back of the head. Back of the head, there was another scalp hematoma there. The next few points talks about base of skull fractures. And they, base of skull, if I may demonstrate. So, my lord, this is a model of a skull. During our post-mortem examination, we remove the top of the skull so that we may examine the skull on the inside and the outside. We then remove the brain so we can examine the brain, and we can examine the inside or the base of skull. So the fractures that are documented talking about the base of skull fractures, they refer to these areas. So in the front of the base of skull and the middle of the base of skull, and extending to the right parietal lobe, which is the bone on the side of the skull. Okay, so those are the linear base of skull fractures. And then I would like to go to the last point, which describes a depressed skull fracture of the left parietal bone with loose bone fragments. So this particular fracture is in this area. So this is the area of the parietal, this is the parietal bone of the skull. And in this particular point, they describe a depressed skull fracture, which means that the outer surface of the bone was pressed into the inner surface of the bone, so that it impacted on the brain in that area. And why I want to illustrate this point quite carefully is that the base of skull fractures were not related to this depressed skull fracture. So there was no extension from the depressed skull fracture to the base of skull fractures, or vice versa.
Doctor, just a point of clarification.
Yes.
Could you show the court the positioning, but perhaps attached to the bottom of the skull so we get a better sense of its location?
Okay, so this would be with the attached, and the parietal bone is in this region, my lord.
Is it the left side?
The left side.
Okay.
So towards the top of the head on the left.
Thank you, Doctor.
And then, my lord, going on to intracranial contents, which is point 1.3. To summarize, I mean, I don't need to go through every single point, but there was extensive damage to the brain, which included hemorrhages and lacerations on the outer surface of the brain and within the brain substance itself. In point 1.4, ears, nose, and ears. Again, I'd like to illustrate that area on the skull model. So the first point indicates that there was a fracture of the nasal bone. So this is the bone which underlies the cartilage of the nose. Then there was a fracture of the left inferior orbital ramus in the paranasal sinus. So the left inferior orbital ramus indicates this part of the upper jaw, or the maxilla, just under the eye. And then a fracture of the right inferior orbital ramus in the paranasal area, which is again in that area on the opposite side. So we had fractures of the nose as well as of the two upper jaws. In paragraph 1.5, mouth, tongue, and pharynx, I'd like to illustrate where those fractures are. So there was a fracture of the right upper jaw between the upper lateral incisor and the canine. So this would be in this area, just above the mouth, in that jaw, there was a fracture there. And a fracture of the left upper jaw posterior to the upper left wisdom tooth. So that would be, again, in this area, just above the teeth. And a fracture of the left lower jaw at the angle of the jaw. So that would be at this angle, just over there. In paragraph 1.6, sorry, I've moved on to page 8. In paragraph 1.6, in the chapter on neck structures, this indicates a number of injuries to the neck area. There is hemorrhage of the soft tissues in the area of the left hyoid bone, left horn of the hyoid bone. So just to explain, my lord, what is referred to as your trachea is sitting in your neck. Right on top, you've got a number of bones that you can actually feel. One projection, or what we call the Adam's apple, okay, is the area in which the hyoid bone resides. It's just above that area. Now, the hyoid bone is relatively protected because it is situated in a posterior location in your neck, and it's surrounded by quite thick muscles. So just so that you can understand where we're looking at. So in the first point, that there's hemorrhage in the soft tissues around the area of the left hyoid bone. Then there is a tear of the lateral ligament and capsule between the left horn of the hyoid bone and the body of the hyoid bone. So the hyoid bone literally looks like a wishbone. It's sort of like got a C shape. And this indicates that the capsule around the left horn of the hyoid bone was torn. Okay, so it's an isolated tear in that area. The other positive findings indicate that there was subcutaneous hemorrhage. So subcutaneous just means under the skin of the right side of the neck, extending from the angle of the right mandible to the clavicle. So this area of the neck showed hemorrhage. And there was a tear of the right sternocleidomastoid muscle at the attachment to the medial aspect of the right clavicle. So the sternocleidomastoid muscle, you can see it just under your skin. And so there was a tear of that muscle at its attachment to the clavicle.
Were these wounds that you're now describing
Yes, my lord.
on the visible, on the surface, or were they internal wounds?
These were all internal wounds on the internal neck structures. And then on to paragraph 1.7, the chest and the diaphragm. So in this paragraph, it indicates that there were a number of fractures of the diaphragm and injury to, of the ribs and injuries to the diaphragm. The first point indicates that there was a fracture of the lateral aspect of the first rib on the left. Now, the first rib is a very short rib, and it's a very protected structure. So it's tucked under the clavicle, and it's very difficult to get to that rib specifically without damaging the surrounding structures. The next point indicates there are fractures of ribs 3 to 6 paravertebrally on the left. Paravertebrally just means next to the vertebra, so it's the posterior aspect of the thoracic cage next to the vertebra. Then there are fractures of ribs 1 to 7 laterally and posteriorly on the right. There are fractures of ribs 8 to 11 paravertebrally on the right. And there are contusions of the dome of the left hemidiaphragm and of the right hemidiaphragm at the areas of the attachment to the ribs. So the diaphragm is sitting at the bottom of your thoracic cavity, and those areas showed contusions, or in other words, bruising of the internal organs. The other points, I would like to skip to paragraph 1.10, indicating pleura and lungs. This just shows that there was extensive laceration or tears in the lung tissue, as well as collections of blood in the chest. I'm now going on to page number 9. In page number 9, I just want to illustrate in point 1.11 the large blood vessels. There is avulsion of the left renal vessels. So essentially what this means is that the blood vessels that lead to the kidney were completely sheared off as a result of a blood force. So it was completely torn off so that the kidney was left free-floating without any vascular attachment. In paragraph 1.14, the liver, there are subcapsular lacerations of the inferior and anterior aspects of the right lobe. So a laceration is a tear in the liver. There is an intraparenchymal rupture of the right lobe of the liver. This means that there was literally the whole lobe of the right liver was ruptured or broken up into pieces. And then I'm moving on now to page number 10 in the paragraph 1.16. The spine, there was a fracture of the body of the 7th cervical vertebra, and the spinal cord was not examined. So the 7th cervical vertebra is sitting literally at the base of the neck, where the neck and the chest meet. That's where you find the 7th cervical vertebra. I'd like to go through paragraph 1.17, which is the histological analysis that was done. In the first point, it shows that there were multiple sections of skin wounds were taken for histological analysis by Dr. Skeppers during the post-mortem examination. However, the post-mortem report does not clearly indicate which wounds were sampled. In at least 5 of the sections sampled from the various skin wounds, the findings were consistent with wounds of 4 to 6 days old. The histological analysis done by Dr. Skeppers further indicates that certain bruises were sampled and were assessed as being recent. The histology of the internal organs confirmed that the tear in the soft tissues around the highway bone was recent. Dr. Gluckman, an independent pathologist, also reviewed the histological sections that were taken. Dr. Gluckman concurred with the finding that the sampled skin wounds were 4 to 6 days old. Dr. Gluckman's assessment indicated that some of the bruises that were sampled appeared older than 12 hours. In other words, they were not recent. So in that one point, he differs with the opinion given by Dr. Skeppers. So, my lord, I'll now go on to the discussion based on my interpretations of the findings, and that is under the paragraph discussion and comment.
Before you do that,
Yes, my lord.
this, on the histology,
Yes,
the 4 to 6 days old is
yes,
determined from the date of death.
that is correct. So from the date of death, my lord, that is correct.
And they were able to determine that some of these wounds were inflicted 4 to 6 days before.
Prior to the death.
Oh, I see. Now, this one of Dr. Clarkman's assessment about the 12 hours,
Yes.
can we just park there a bit? I just want to understand what is he saying here.
Okay, so you'll see that as part of what they sampled, so they sampled a number of wounds, and some of the wounds that were sampled were actually bruises. Now, in the histological assessment of the bruises that was done by Dr. Skeppers, he found the bruises to be recent. In other words, recent means that they are fresh bruises. Whereas Dr. Gluckman's assessment indicated that the bruises were older than 12 hours, so they had been there at least 12 hours before the death.
Yes. But Dr. Skeppers did not qualify what he meant by recent.
He did not.
Okay, proceed.
So in the discussion and comment, so the cause of death, as stated in the post-mortem report, was multiple injuries. It was alleged that the injuries were sustained in a fall from a height. As paragraph 2.1, what I've done is I've just discussed the features that one would expect to see in a fall from a height. In cases of falls from a height, injuries are sustained from the impact of the body on the surface on which it lands, the impact on the body on any intervening surfaces that collide with the body as it falls. So by this, my lord, if a body is falling from a height and if there's anything, sort of a projection from a building or anything else in the trajectory of the fall, that, whatever it is, can leave wounds or impact on the body as it falls. Transmitted forces extending from the areas of impact. So, in other words, if you land, for example, on your feet, because of the impact of that force on your foot, you can get what we call transmitted forces that actually travel right up your body, and you can see the end stage of that force, for example, in the spinal column or the neck and the head. Okay, so most of the time in falls from a height where somebody lands on their feet, the reason why you get base of skull fractures when there's no direct impact onto the head is because of transmission of forces. Okay. And then the acceleration, deceleration, and rotational forces that act on the body during the fall as a result of gravitational force. So, my lord, when a body falls from a height, it doesn't mean that that body is stationary. It may move, and it may turn, so it may have what we call acceleration, deceleration, or forces that go fast and slow that impact on the body, as well as rotational forces that can turn things in the body. So even to the extent that when you are falling, your head may look stationary as it falls. But because the brain is sitting in that cavity and it's got its own space, it may actually move independently by itself. And then the acceleration or deceleration and rotational forces may act even within the body and impact on the internal organs. I'm now moving on to page number 11. In injuries that occur as a direct result of a fall from a height, the severity of the injuries generally depends on the height from which the fall occurs. Hence, more severe injuries would be seen at falls from greater heights. Generally, falls from heights greater than 15 meters are associated with injuries in 2 to 3 regions of the body. The injuries sustained as a result from the fall from a height would be ante-mortem recent injuries. In other words, ante-mortem, from the way that forensic pathologists use the word, it means that these injuries were incurred before the person died. Okay, so clinical death is when the heart stops beating and you stop breathing. So ante-mortem injury would be any injuries that are sustained before the heart stops beating and before you stop breathing. And then recent injuries would indicate that the injuries should be fresh and not old. Injuries would occur at the site or sites of impact and would be most severe at the points of impact. So when a body falls from a height, as we've said, the body could impact on many different things as it falls. But the primary impact, so where the body lands, the first place that the body hits whatever it's landing on, that's where you're going to see the most severe injuries. Okay? The body can have a number of impacts. So even when it hits the ground, it may not be that there'll only be one impact with the ground. It may in fact have more than one impact. But you could actually see almost a degradation of injuries. So the primary impact would be the most severe injuries, and then the other impacts would be severe injuries as well, but maybe not as severe as the first impact.
Doctor, just to clarify,
Yes.
in your report you refer to sites of impact and points of impact. Am I right in saying that those two mean the same?
That is correct.
But the primary point of impact would be the initial first impact?
That's correct, the first impact. In the next point, the types of external injuries most often seen would be as a result of blunt force, which could occur from impact with blunt objects and from perforation of the skin by bone fractures that protrude externally. These injuries would be seen at the site or sites of impact and include abrasions, bruises, and lacerations. So we would expect to see blunt force injuries in a fall from a height. In point number 2.2, I've discussed the correlation of the injuries with the history that was given of a fall from a height. So the post-mortem findings indicate that all the wounds on the body were ante-mortem. In other words, they were all sustained before death. There are a number of wounds that could not be attributed to a fall from a height. So there are the following multiple external wounds which showed scab formation, indicating that the wounds were present before the fatal fall and were not caused by the fall. So once you have scab formation, my lord, it shows that the wound is in the process of healing, and therefore it cannot be that those wounds were incurred during the fall from a height. The wounds are a small abrasion with scab formation over the middle third of the right clavicle, which is the collarbone area, an abrasion with scab formation of the right scapula or the shoulder blade. And now going on to page number 12. A small abrasion with scab formation of the left lateral neck, situated 3 centimeters below the earlobe, and a 2.5 centimeter by 4 millimeter abrasion with scab formation across the left forearm. In addition, the histological analysis showed that the wounds sampled were between 4 to 6 days old. And according to the analysis done by Dr. Skeepers, in at least 5 of the sections sampled from the various skin wounds, the findings were consistent with wounds of 4 to 6 days old. And Dr. Gluckman concurred with the finding that the skin wounds were 4 to 6 days old. The post-mortem report further indicates that there were multiple bruises all over the body. As discussed above, injuries caused by a fall from height would be found at the site or the sites of impact, and this would account for some but not all of the bruises that were documented at the post-mortem examination, because the bruises on the deceased's body were diffusely distributed. Based on my years of training and experience as a forensic pathologist, bruises in falls from height tend to be more irregular and poorly defined, whereas most of the bruises that can be seen in the photographs are well-defined, patterned bruises, and therefore not consistent with a fall from a height. So when we're talking about well-defined versus irregular, we're talking about the margin of the bruises. So the bruises that were seen on the body of the deceased, most of them were very well circumscribed. In other words, they were very regular and they looked patterned. In other words, they looked as if you could see clearly the outline of the bruises. Therefore, as can be seen in the post-mortem photographs, the multiple, round, well-defined pattern bruises that can be seen in multiple different areas on the body are not consistent with the types of bruises that we would expect to see in a fall from a height. So I've just outlined all those areas of the bruising that are not consistent with a fall from a height that can be seen in the photographs. It's outlined in red. You'll see the images in page number 12, page number 13, and page number 14, and page number 15. And now on page number 15, most of the bruises that occur in a fall from a height are not isolated. So in other words, they are not there on their own, the bruises are generally associated with other blunt force injuries like abrasions and lacerations because of the different mechanisms that occur while the body is falling from a height. You would not expect to find just a bruise. You would expect to find other blunt force injuries in the same area. The photographs show that there are multiple isolated pattern bruises which would not be consistent with the bruises commonly found in falls from height. Unfortunately, the post-mortem report does not detail the color of the bruises, which would prove an additional indication as to whether the bruises were old or recent. So, my lord, bruises change color. So a bruise that is more recent is usually a purple or red color, and as the bruise ages, it goes then from purple or red to blue to green to yellow. So if you document a bruise, we always talk about the color of the bruise because it would indicate a fresh bruise and differentiate it from an older bruise. In addition, Dr. Gluckman's assessment indicated that some of the bruises that were sampled appeared older than 12 hours. In other words, they were not recent. In the next paragraph, the internal injuries that are consistent with a fall from a height could include the limb fractures, the extensive scalp hematoma of the frontal areas bilaterally extending to the lower forehead, the scalp hematoma of the left occipital area, the base of skull fracture, which extends through the left orbital plate of the frontal bone of the anterior cranial fossa, through the ethmoid bone and the sella turcica, and extends to the right anterior middle cranial fossa, just anterior to the petrous bone. Those were the ones that I illustrated for you as we were going through the injuries. And the crack fracture of the right anterior cranial fossa, extending to the lesser wing of the sphenoid bone and the right parietal bone, and extending to the midline again. That was illustrated in the discussion of the injuries. The extensive injuries to the brain, the tears and hemorrhages of the strap muscles of the neck, the fractures of the ribs, 3 to 6 paravertebrally on the left, 1 to 7 laterally and posteriorly on the right, 8 to 11 paravertebrally on the right. Sorry, I'm going now to page 16. The contusions of the diaphragm, the extensive lung injuries, the avulsion of the renal vessels, the injuries to the liver, and the fracture of the 7th cervical vertebrae, in other words, the fracture of the vertebrae in the neck. So those were the findings that you could say are attributable to the fall from height. Based on my years of training and experience as a forensic pathologist and on the current research available, the following injuries are not in keeping with the pattern of injuries that would likely be seen in a fall from a height and must be explained. These are the depressed skull fracture of the left parietal bone with loose bone fragments. This fracture seems unrelated to the site of impact and is not associated with the linear base of skull fractures. Isolated depressed skull fractures are not commonly seen in falls from heights and must be explained in the context of the fall. The following documented facial fractures appear to be isolated and not directly associated with a base of skull fracture. The fracture of the nasal bone, the fracture of the left inferior orbital ramus in the paranasal area, the fracture of the right inferior orbital ramus in the paranasal area, the fracture of the right upper jaw between the upper lateral incisor and the canine, the fracture of the left upper jaw posterior to the upper left wisdom tooth, and the fracture of the left lower jaw at the angle of the jaw. So those were the facial fractures that I identified for you, my lord, in the first part of the presentation. If the face, I'm moving on now to page number 17. If the face was one of the points of impact in the fall from a height, a greater severity of injuries would be expected, and the injuries would commonly be associated with other blunt force injuries like lacerations and abrasions. Thus, these isolated facial fractures are not consistent with a fall from a height. The post-mortem photograph of the face demonstrates that the face did not sustain damage as would be expected in an impact from a fall from a height. In the next point, a tear of the lateral ligament and capsule between the left horn of the hyoid bone and the body of the hyoid bone. The hyoid bone is a relatively protected structure at the back of the throat, and an isolated injury in this area would not be consistent with injuries caused from a fall from a height. It is more likely that force would have to be applied directly to this area to cause injuries. So in other words, my lord, we would expect that there would be a direct force to that area at the back of the neck that would cause that injury. Fractures of the lateral aspect of the first rib on the left. The first rib is a relatively protected structure, and an isolated injury in this area would not be consistent with injuries caused from a fall from a height. In general, a force would have to be applied specifically to this area to cause injuries. I'm now moving on to page number 18. In paragraph 3, the conclusion. I concur with the cause of death as multiple injuries. The post-mortem findings indicate multiple fatal injuries consistent with the fall from a height. However, there are a number of injuries that are not consistent with the fall from a height. The implication is that these injuries must have been present prior to the fatal fall, and that the injuries were sustained during the time that the deceased was in police custody, which include the following as previously discussed: the multiple external wounds with scab formation. Histological analysis on the wounds indicates that there were many wounds that were sampled which were estimated to be 4 to 6 days old, which confirmed that these wounds were present before the fall from a height. The multiple diffuse, well-defined patterned bruises. The multiple facial fractures that do not appear to be related to the base of skull fracture sustained in the fall. The isolated depressed skull fracture, which is rare in a fall from a height. A tear of the soft tissues around the hyoid bone, and a fracture of the first rib. The multiple injuries that were present on the body of the deceased, which could not be ascribed to the fall from a height, indicate that the deceased sustained physical assault while in police custody prior to his death. This finding calls into question the conclusion of the original inquest process that the manner of death was suicide, and therefore this finding must be challenged.
Thank you, Doctor. The Lord, it's approaching 10:15. We do have some follow-up questions, but this might be an appropriate time to take a tea break.
Yes. We'll adjourn until 11:30.
All right.
Yes, Mr. Mann.
Thank you. Dr. Holland, I have a few questions, follow-up questions, on the evidence you've given, which is based on your report. I can direct you to page 16 of your report. More than that's on page 150. That's a bullet point almost halfway down the page. And I'll just read the first sentence to you. Based on my years of training and experience as a forensic pathologist and on the current research available, the following injuries are not in keeping with a pattern of injury that would likely be seen in a fall from height and must be explained. So firstly, Dr. Holland, when you say must be explained, would I be correct in saying must be explained by those who are holding him in their custody?
I'd put it more that it must be explained in the situation in which the deceased was before he fell from a height.
Thank you. You then list a series of injuries, and let's start with the first one. That is a depressed skull fracture of the left parietal bone with loose bone fragments. You then go on to say that this injury is unrelated to the other injuries on the skull. And you furthermore say that isolated depressed skull fractures are not commonly seen in falls from heights and must be explained in the context of the fall. So again, you're suggesting that the depressed skull fracture of the left parietal bone with those loose bone fragments out of keeping with typical injuries seen from a fall from a height. So if it can't be explained from the fall, what would cause such an injury?
So again, a depressed skull fracture would be caused by direct force to that aspect of the skull. So in this case, it would mean a direct blunt force to the top of the head.
And can you elaborate on this blunt force? Could it be with a fist, with a
Okay.
boot, an instrument?
I will do so. So the nature of the skull is that it's a very thick bone. So to be able to cause a depressed skull fracture, you would need blunt force with a large amount of force. So a fist would not do it. You would need some sort of blunt object.
Could that be a boot?
If, for example, if the boot was a steel cap boot, it would be possible.
So if the deceased happened to be on the ground and being kicked with a hard boot or a steel cap boot, could that do it?
I do not wish to propose or object unnecessarily, but that is speculation to the highest degree, Lord, where we are going with this evidence. To try and recreate or a scenario of what is possible. Anything might be possible, my Lord, but there must be a basis for such a submission or such a speculation as to the cause of this blunt force trauma to the head and the skull. To identify or to try and identify the object that caused the blunt force merely by looking at the injury, I don't think that is correctly speculated.
Well, it happens in criminal trials where you would want to know which category of blunt objects would yield this kind of or cause this kind of injury. That is not outside the realm of questioning. I would like to know, is it a sharp instrument? Is the blunt instrument? What kind of instrument would do that? Just a whole range of them, not a specific one. Then the court will then be able to link that with other possible evidence, if it's so.
It can indicate the type of force, the type of instrument that can cause it, but not
Absolutely.
that the man was lying on the floor and being kicked in the head.
Yes, well, he's painting out a scenario, but I take the point you're saying. Yeah.
Thank you, Lord.
Doctor, that particular injury, what kind of instruments can cause that injury?
So, my Lord, as I was saying, because the skull is such a thick bone, you would actually need some sort of object to cause that kind of injury to the skull. So, commonly what we see is where somebody is struck on the head with something like a hammer, with a heavy, blunt object. That's commonly what we see in our practice. And those are the types of weapons that could cause that type of injury.
Stefan?
Thank you, Lord. Aside from a hammer, what other instruments could potentially cause such an injury? For example, an iron rod?
That would be consistent with that type of injury as well.
If we can move to the other injuries you've listed.
Before you do that, Doctor, is this the injury that you described as having caused or been transmitted to the brain?
No, my Lord. So the base of skull fractures are the injuries that we consider to be transmitted force injuries.
Yes.
So those are the ones that where the force is transmitted from elsewhere in the body. So in a case of a fall from a height, the force would be transmitted from the point of impact, and it would reach the base of the skull via transmitted force.
Yes.
So this particular section, including the depressed skull fracture, is not consistent with the pattern of injuries that we should see in a fall from a height.
Yes, but then in respect of the brain,
Yes.
did it have any effect on the brain?
My Lord, that is a difficult question to answer because of the extent of the brain injury. So there were extensive brain injuries. It was very difficult to tease out which of the fractures were related to the specific brain injury.
Dr. Holland, we had similar question in relation to the other injuries that you've listed. And there's several under the category of facial fractures. And again, you say these appear to be isolated, not directly associated with the base of skull fracture. These include fractures of the nasal bone, the left interior orbital ramus, the right interior orbital ramus, the right upper jaw, left upper jaw, and left lower jaw. Again, the question is, what potentially could have caused such injuries?
My Lord, those types of injuries are an indication that blunt force was used to create the injuries. Because of the nature of the bone of the face, the bones of the face, in the areas where the fractures were, it is possible that you could get those types of injuries just from somebody punching you in the face, or something like a kick in the face would be sufficient force to cause those injuries. Having said that, they could also be caused by blunt objects. So something like perhaps a baton, for example, so something like a rod-shaped blunt instrument could also, to the face, could also do that kind of damage. But in those cases where if it was a heavier object with a greater amount of force, you would have expected more diffuse injuries.
Thank you, Doctor. Doctor, I'm going to return to the question of the impact that these injuries had on Mr. Timol. But so that I don't forget, the injuries to the fractures of the right upper jaw, left upper jaw, and left lower jaw, would that have allowed Mr. Timol to talk? Would it have allowed him to drink a cup of coffee?
I would say that it would be very difficult to drink a cup of coffee or talk sufficiently especially with the fracture of the lower jaw. So, my Lord, this particular area, if this is fractured, it means that there's extensive injury to the lower jaw. So it would be very difficult to talk properly or coherently with this kind of fracture, or to drink properly. I mean, most of the time you'd have to use a straw or some other object when you have that type of fracture.
Thank you, Doctor. You also spoke about contusions on the cuts, if I can call it in layperson's terms, on the inside of the mouth. What would cause such an injury?
So, my Lord, in fact, a contusion is a bruise. So it's a bruise on the inside of the mouth. And often you see those kinds of contusions because of the fact that the teeth impact the inner surface of the lip when the face sustains a blunt force. So in this case, because there were no lacerations or no tears, it's possible that something like, for example, a force like an open slap or maybe a punch could have caused those injuries to the inside of the lip.
Doctor, you also made reference to bruising on the leg. You've identified that in photograph 4. And Your Lordship, I believe that photograph 4 seems to be the back. But if we could just talk about bruising on the leg.
Is it photograph 6? 6 or 7?
Identify the photograph that identifies bruising
on the lower limbs. Yes. So it's in page number. Photo number 6 would indicate the bruising to the posterior thigh. And then unfortunately, I think, and then also in photograph number 7, you can clearly see the bruising of the groin area and of the lateral thigh.
So Doctor, you've testified that because of the pattern of bruising, these bruises are not consistent with the fall. We've heard evidence from a witness who was detained with Mr. Timol that he sustained repeated mule kicks to the legs. Are any of these injuries consistent with, or potentially consistent with mule kicks?
In fact, it was one of the statements that you asked me to assess after our meeting. And may I refer to the statement? My Lord, these are excerpts from the statement that was made by Dr. Esop. And
That's Helen Esop.
Yes.
So in this particular scenario that was put to me, just want to find the page, Your Worship. So in page number 40 of the statement, it's one of the areas that is detailed that there was punching and kicking all over the body. Rapid succession of very heavy full force kicks on the thighs and lower legs. And then falling against the floor as well. So in this particular statement, the punching and the kicking to the lower legs, you would find bruises that could be similar to what was found on the deceased body.
And Doctor, what would the impact of such kicking, sometimes referred as mule kicking, have on a particular victim?
So it's difficult for me to comment on that because it's not really in my area of expertise. But from a physiological perspective, just as a medical doctor, if you sustain multiple blows to your lower limbs that were severe enough to cause these multifocal bruising all over your lower limbs, it would be very difficult to stand because the underlying muscles of the legs would also be bruised. So it would be very painful and would be very difficult to stand because of the pain.
And would it, in your view, have an impact on the ability to move around?
It would, my Lord. It would impact on mobility.
Doctor, you mentioned that bruises change colour. Would I be correct in saying that a bruise that has just been sustained would be purple or red in colour, and that as the hours and days unfolded, it would turn to blue, then green, and then yellow?
That is correct.
So, Doctor, unfortunately, we are hamstrung a little by the quality of the black and white photographs. But because the bruises on these photographs appear to be darker in colour, that they are therefore more likely to have been recent bruises as opposed to older bruises.
That's difficult for me to say conclusively because bruises do become darker, but essentially the older bruises are sometimes darker than more recent bruises. Okay. So it becomes difficult.
Doctor, if you could just talk a little bit about electric shocks. We have heard evidence that Mr. Esop, who was in detention at the same time on the same floor as Mr. Timol, sustained repeated electric shocks. Am I right in saying that it's very difficult to detect electric shocks, say, in a post-mortem examination?
So, my Lord, the wounds that occur from electrocution are caused by the burning of the skin at the point when the electric current makes contact with the body and at the point where the electric current exits the body. But due to the nature of the fact that you may not, the currents or the size, the amount of electricity is different, the effect on the skin is different, you may in fact not see anything on the body in somebody that has undergone electrocution or has received some form of electrocution. So in cases that we do, we may have a history, a very reliable history, that somebody had died from electrocution, but the post-mortem examination does not show any wounds because of the nature of the variables that can be involved with the process. So it is possible, my lord, that if somebody had some form of electrocution or some sort of electric shock therapy, you wouldn't see any marks or wounds on the body.
Thank you, Doctor. Doctor, on the basis of your examination of the post-mortem report, you have concluded in your review of that report that Mr. Timol was alive when he fell and alive for some time after the fall.
My lord, so as I've explained, what we call antemortem, in other words, injuries that occurred before death, all you would need is somebody to have a beating heart and to still be breathing. So all the injuries that were documented in the post-mortem report I interpret as being antemortem. So it includes the injuries that occurred as a fall from a height and the injuries that occurred that were not seemingly related to the fall from a height. When it comes to a question of how long somebody can survive fatal injuries, it becomes very difficult. We are not able to give accurate time intervals in terms of, like 10 seconds or 5 minutes. What we can say is seconds, minutes, and hours. With the nature of the fatal injuries, so in other words, the injuries that had been sustained as a result of the fall from a height, I don't think that the deceased would have survived longer than seconds to maybe a few minutes.
Thank you, Doctor. So is there a possibility that at the time of the fall, Mr. Timol was alive but not conscious?
It is possible.
And following up from that, if one considers the non-fall injuries that you have described, could any of them have rendered him unconscious?
So, my lord, I think it is possible. I mean, if you look at particularly the depressed skull fracture that we were discussing earlier, like I said, to actually cause a depressed skull fracture in that part of the skull, you would need a large amount of force. And with that amount of force, it is possible that the subsequent or the injuries that occurred as a result on the brain were sufficient enough to cause a loss of consciousness.
Could you paint perhaps a worst case and a best case scenario arising from the non-fall injuries, and in particular the depressed skull fracture?
So, my lord, I must state again that my expertise is really in wounds, post-mortem wounds, in other words, wounds that are on people that have already been deceased. So I can give you a correlation that in fact these injuries, the best case scenario would be somebody that had what is commonly called a concussion. So in other words, they may lose consciousness for a short amount of time and then may have some form of confusion and sometimes some physical side effects, like mobility effects, but generally they are revivable. And then the worst case scenario would be somebody that is completely unconscious because of the extent of the damage to the brain.
Doctor, if you could just stay a bit with the worst case scenario, somebody would potentially be unconscious, but could paralysis, partial paralysis or full paralysis set in?
It is possible, my lord, that as we've said, the injury, the skull fracture that is in that area, we need a direct force to that area. Because of the fact that the bone would then go impact onto the brain, if there was significant hemorrhage and injury to the brain in that area, you could have an effect as if somebody had a stroke. So in other words, there would be related mobility, either lack of mobility or temporary paralysis in that area. So similar to if somebody had a stroke.
So that could involve brain bleeding and swelling.
That is correct.
As a matter of interest, Doctor, if that were not treated, were left untreated, and let's just take the fall out of the picture for a moment, what could happen to such a person?
If it's left untreated, it is possible that that injury in itself could be fatal.
So a person in this worst-case scenario, in your view, what would his or her mobility be like? And more specifically, could this person get up and jump and dive?
I think that would be unlikely, my lord. May I say, I've also been given pictures of the scene as to, it was the room in which the deceased was held, as well as the statement from the police officer that was with the deceased at the time of his death. May I comment on it now, because I think it is relevant. My lord, it is the photograph, I'm not sure, but it's of the room. And according to the statement from the police officer that was with the deceased was apparently in a chair on the opposite side of a large table, and then had moved around the table and then allegedly got to the window.
Yes. I also don't want to object at this stage, but my problem in this matter is, where does the fact that the witness that was last seen with the deceased, where does this witness get that information?
She can answer that question. It is in the public records of the inquest that was held before. That version is in the inquest that was held before.
The Lord, just for the record, I'm advised by my learned junior that particular photograph is in volume B, in other words, the original inquest record. That's exhibit AA1. Is that it's exhibit AA1 28.
AA1.
Lord, that particular copy, I assume because it's been photocopied a few times, is not particularly clear, and we will provide our learned friends as well as the court a better copy of that photograph. You may proceed.
What I have are kind of drawings and not photographs. These. You're referring to these?
Yes, Your Lordship.
Is she having these drawings? It looks like she has a photograph.
She has a better version of that photocopy.
Where do I find that on the record?
My Lord, currently I don't think it is part of the record, and as I mentioned, we will undertake to provide the court and our learned colleagues with a better quality photo.
Is it the only copy available?
My Lord, what we did is that we copied this picture from the book that was published by Mr. Imtiaz Kaji. And perhaps when he gives evidence, he can indicate where he got it from. But it is the same photograph from what we can tell.
Yes, I mean, I have to have that. I mean, if you're going to question me about a photograph that I don't have here, I don't have a photograph, I have just a drawing. Mr. Advocate Pretorius, do you have anything like that, a photograph?
Yes, my lord. From a picture in one of the newspapers, that particular one that you refer to as a sketch is actually a photograph, but it's been photographed so much that it looks like just the outlines of the sketch. But in one of the newspapers specifically, we found one that was much clearer, and that was blown up. And I can try to go and obtain that copy side. There you can see much better. There's a photograph from one of the newspapers that we've enhanced, and that can be used better, Michael.
I think it would be better to have that.
If we can stand down, I can go and look and see if I can get copies of that one.
Because it's going to be difficult for me to follow the question. What I know is that I have this drawing that appears to be similar to that photograph. But it looks like it's not a drawing. From what Advocate Pretorius is saying, is a copy of that photograph which has faded.
As the court pleases, we can hold back that particular evidence until Mr. Pretorius is able to locate that photograph and make copies.
Yeah, it might be advisable to do so. And I'm not sure whether you can get this witness to reconstruct what transpired in that room.
But Lord, I'm on the view that this particular evidence from this witness is not that critical, and I'm happy to...
Yes, because she wasn't there. She'll only be testifying on the version of the police as we have it, even though it was found by the magistrate to be so.
Yes. Look, we do have a copy of the book, but I don't think we have copies for all the parties, so we'll just stick to our original decision of not pursuing this evidence with this particular witness. Doctor, we're not going to pursue evidence on what specifically took place in that room 1026. If I can return to the non-fall injuries, and you have testified already that the depressed skull fracture could potentially have rendered Mr. Timol unconscious. In your expert view, would you be able to say potentially how long could he have been unconscious?
It would be very difficult to say.
And is it possible that he might have slipped in and out of consciousness?
That is possible, my lord.
There is evidence, Dr. Holland, that one of the police officers who rushed to the scene picked up a pulse, and at that stage it would have been what I understand is called a peripheral pulse on the wrist. But after they had moved Mr. Timol to the foyer of John Vorster Square, that peripheral pulse had gone. Is it possible for a victim who has fallen 10 stories to still have a pulse, but not necessarily a peripheral pulse?
So, my lord, as I've said to you, the injuries that were sustained as a result of the fall from a height were severe. And you would not expect somebody to survive longer than seconds to a few minutes with those types of injuries. Having said that, because of the nature of what happens to a body when it undergoes such severe injuries, it would be very difficult to feel a pulse, a peripheral pulse or a pulse at the wrist, because essentially what happens is that you have peripheral shutdown. So your body shuts down and it tries to direct all your vital energy in your blood to the central aspect of your body. So it would be very unlikely to be able to feel a peripheral pulse, even if the deceased had survived, for a short time after the fatal fall.
Are you specifically referring to the pulse on the wrist?
That is correct.
And what about on the neck?
I would say, my lord, that if you are a healthcare professional, so somebody who knows how to do
Thank you, Richard. Doctor, given the circumstances of this particular case, where the police were aware that Mr. Timol had fallen 10 stories, after they had raced to the scene, was it advisable for them to have quickly moved Mr. Timol?
Again, I'm not speaking in my expertise as a forensic pathologist, but as a medical doctor, the first rule is that you don't ever move a patient before you have ascertained the extent of the injuries. So it would not have been advisable.
And in your view, should they in fact have made sure that the head or neck was prevented from moving to prevent further damage?
My lord, if you have basic first aid training, not even intermediate or high level first aid training like a paramedic, you also know that one of the first rules is that you always secure the head and neck before you even attempt a move.
There's also evidence put up by the police that Mr. Timol fell through some shrubs. In the post-mortem report, did you see any record of shrubs being found on the body or the clothing or embedded in the skin?
My lord, the post-mortem report does not detail any vegetative matter on the body at all, and there's no detail about the clothes that the deceased was wearing.
Would you be able to assist the court by considering where you think, or how rather, the body landed? How Mr. Timol hit the ground?
Unfortunately, I won't be able to do that, my lord, because there are no adequate reconstructions of the event, so it would be very difficult for me to comment on it. One thing I can say is that the limb fractures that are documented seem to be on the right side of the body, so the right elbow and the right midshaft of the right femur, the right thigh, which means that he would have somehow sustained impact onto the right side during the fall.
But is there any observation by the two previous pathologists as to what you describe as the primary?
So essentially, the post-mortem report just documents the post-mortem findings. There is no interpretation of those findings. So we're able to, so for pathologists to then interpret the findings and say, okay, this is the most likely, the primary impact of injury because this is the greatest severity of the injury, you would need the pathologist to comment on that and to interpret that based on the findings. So, and I don't know if they ever testify to it, but it is not generally part of a report. It is usually an opinion that is given during the inquest or during the trial that follows.
Okay, thank you.
Doctor, I've been reminded that there were some non-fall injuries that you had listed that I have yet to ask you what caused them. Just two. The left first rib.
So the fracture of the first rib on the left, as I've stated, that is, the first rib is a very short rib, and it's very protected in its situation in the thoracic cavity. So one would need a directed blunt force to impact that rib for it to fracture. And something like a blunt object, as described earlier, would be needed to be able to fracture that rib.
And then lastly, the hyoid bone. I beg your pardon, it's the hyoid bone. As you mentioned under the photograph on page 17 of the report.
So, my lord, as discussed, the hyoid bone is a very protected structure at the back of the throat. So for you to have an injury, so in other words, there's a thin capsule that surrounds the hyoid bone, and according to the post-mortem report, that capsule was torn. And for you to have injury in that area, so it's a very relatively protected structure in that part of the neck, and it appears to be isolated from the other injuries to the rest of the neck. You would actually need blunt force directed to that area. it may not be a direct force. In other words, it may not be a direct force. It could even be a transmitted force or a acceleration, deceleration injury. And in my opinion, the most likely action that would cause it is some sort of hyperextension of the neck. So in other words, if somebody had, or if the deceased had his neck hyperextended to this kind of position, it could cause a tear in the capsule of the neck.
Thank you. Lordship, I have no further questions.
Thank you. Advocate Pretoris?
Thank you, my Lord. Doctor, I want to ask you, you identified certain injuries that you would not ascribe to the fall from height, and you enumerated that in your report specifically. Could those injuries that you enumerate there, even on the last page, even before that where you said it's not related to the fall from height, could that in itself have caused the person to die? Could that have been fatal in itself?
Of the injuries that were described that were not consistent with a fall from a height, the injury that would have in itself been fatal would be the depressed skull fracture.
From all the information that you could ascertain and from the reports of post-mortem, would you be able to say if this person was still alive on the point of impact from the fall from height?
My Lord, based on the analysis of the post-mortem report, it appears that the deceased was alive at the time of the impact of the fall.
From how do you determine that, Doctor?
So, my Lord, there's a difference between the appearance of wounds that occur ante-mortem versus post-mortem. So the wounds appear differently, and you don't often get the extent of the hemorrhage or contusion around each wound. So based on the post-mortem report and the analysis of it, the description of the wounds was such that indicated that the wounds were all ante-mortem.
I want to move a little bit just back to the mule kicks that you were also asked about, page 144 of the record, page 10 of your report. Pictures actually page 13, page 147, there we see the bruise on the left thigh, not so.
That's correct.
But you also found a bruise on the right thigh, is that also not so? Just on the page 145, I think, you also found bruises on the right thigh, not so.
So, my Lord, I didn't find the bruises. Just to clarify that the interpretation was that these are the wounds that were identified on the original post-mortem examination and documented in the original post-mortem reports. So there's a number of bruises to the lower limbs that are documented in the reports but are not seen on the photographs.
Thank you, my Lord. That's all the questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Advocate Kusi. Or Thompson? No questions.
Thank you, Lord. I do have some questions. Thank you, Doctor. Doctor, you have obviously studied the photographs, the post-mortem reports, and other statements by possible witnesses. Is it correct?
My Lord, that is correct. I must say, the only statements from other witnesses that I have are the statement that was made by Dr. Esop during this particular inquest, and then from the original inquest, I've got the statements from Daisel and Rodriguez.
Did you, in compiling your report and considering the injuries, did you also take note of the evidence that was presented in the inquest by the various experts?
My Lord, I didn't have access to any of the information or anything from the previous inquest before the report was compiled. So when I compiled the report, the only information that I had access to was the original post-mortem report done by Dr. Skeppers and the post-mortem photographs.
I just see from the report, or from the evidence rather, in the post-mortem that Dr. Gluckman appeared in the post-mortem on instructions of the family and obviously the lawyers acting on behalf of Mr. Timol. And he attended to the actual post-mortem with Dr. Skeepers. Is that correct?
I don't have access to those records, my lord.
Right.
Just refer us to the volume.
My lord, this is the record of the inquest. I believe that is Annexure A. And to what I'm referring to is paginated on the record page 784. I don't have a pagination, a separate pagination as the other than the record, the original record's pagination.
Yes.
On page 784, it is indicated that, and that was the evidence of Dr. Gluckman. He says here, and that is the second paragraph, that on the 29th of October 1971, on the instructions received from the attorney acting for Mr. and Mrs. Timol, I attended the post-mortem examination carried out by Dr. N.J. Skeepers on the body of the person which I understand to be that of Mr. Ahmed Timol. Right. Now, what I wish to put to you is that both Dr. Skeepers and Dr. Gluckman were in fact in the best possible position to consider the injuries of the deceased, Mr. Timol.
That's correct, my lord.
Now, the photographs which you considered are of a rather poor quality. It is like a faded black and white, if I can describe it as that. And that is in the exhibit C7.
That's correct, my lord.
Now, both Dr. Skeepers and Dr. Gluckman testified, as well as Professor Koch testified during the inquest extensively in relation to the injuries and the interpretation of the injuries. And all of them were also cross-examined by both the lawyers acting on behalf of Mr. Miles and Mr. Bezos acting on behalf of the family. I put that to you. I know that you have not read the finding. Now, is it your opinion that they were wrong in their findings? That Dr. Skeepers, let's deal with Dr. Skeepers in his report, in his post-mortem report, where he did not identify any serious injuries. There were cuts and bruises that he said that had scab formation, but there's no injuries or serious injuries that he identified which was inconsistent with a fall of that height.
My lord, as it's been stated, I don't have access to the testimony that was given by any of the pathologists at the time of the inquest. And essentially what happens is that the post-mortem report is a detailed documentation by the pathologist of the wounds that were received or the wounds that were identified at the post-mortem examination. And the post-mortem report won't contain opinions of the forensic pathologist about the causation or any of the effects of the wounds. So it is simply a document stating the post-mortem findings at the time of the post-mortem examination. So it does not in general include an opinion, and in this particular case it did not include any opinions.
But the evidence did. And the evidence is captured in the record from page 664 up to page, if I can exclude the argument, it is up to page 1069. In other words, for more than 400 pages of evidence by these experts that testified and were cross-examined and were examined in relation to these injuries. And apart from the injuries with scabs and the injuries that were described as possible fresh injuries apart from the causing the death of the deceased, or that is in relation to the fall, there is no indication that I could find, and I'm sure my learned colleagues will correct me if I'm wrong, there's no indication in this evidence that there were any serious injuries that were inconsistent with a fall that was found on Mr. Timol's body.
So, my lord, essentially, from my report, I've not changed or elaborated on anything. I've just taken the injuries that were documented, and I've interpreted them according to my experience and years of training. And as it is clearly stated, is that from what we see, there is a certain pattern of injuries that we see commonly that occurs as a fall from a height. So based on the fact that there were some injuries that fit the pattern and there were some injuries that did not fit the pattern, that is how I came to my conclusion. So I can't speak to the training or the expertise or the research that the original pathologist had done at the time of the inquest.
But do you agree that they were in a better position than yourself to evaluate specifically Dr. Skeepers and Dr. Gluckman were specifically in a better position to assess the injuries and to make a finding in relation to the injuries in relation to the fall?
So, my lord, I do agree that they were in a better position to identify the injuries that were found on the deceased. So as I stated, those were the injuries that were documented in the post-mortem report. As to the fact that were they in a better position to interpret the injuries, that I don't agree with.
Yes, and just to further indicate to you that throughout this inquest, the learned magistrate was assessed by Dr. Simmons, if I'm not mistaken, yes, who was also an expert who assisted him. And these issues with regard to the injuries were fully ventilated in this trial. And they...
Yes. I'm not sure that this was fully ventilated in the trial. My memory, and I'll go and check specifically, is that it was more as to the timing.
Exactly.
It was more to the timing of, was this 4 to 6 days before, or was it longer? The length of the cells, that was the big issue. But fully ventilated, I'm not so sure that that's a correct statement of fact to put to this witness. I object to that statement.
But Lord, I agree, and it is difficult reading this cross-examination that took place here, as it seems to revolve in regard to the 4 to 6 or 5 to 8 or the days of the scab forming. But the fact of the matter is that these evidence were presented in court as experts present at the post-mortem that was conducted, and that they were not in disagreement with each other. These issues,
on what? Why do you say they were not in disagreement?
Because they were only taken to task with regard to the formation of the scabs and the duration of the scabs. The further aspects of Dr. Skeepers' report was not attacked by Dr. Gluckman.
Are you saying that I must draw inference to the fact that since the inquest did not focus on the seriousness of the injuries, but on the period or the age, if I may use that word, of the wounds that were inflicted before the fall, that I must therefore draw an inference that anything else that was not placed in dispute was agreed to?
Well, that's how experts work, with great respect. It is once you get experts from both sides of the table, if I can say so, and they formulate what is the discussion that is up for dispute. And if the issues raised by Dr. Skeepers in his post-mortem report was in dispute, the family's advocates and their experts would have taken him to task on that. And the mere fact that both of them were present at the hearing and both of them presented evidence, oral evidence during the inquest, issues that were not disputed between them and was not disputed by the the lawyers at that stage must have been common cause.
No. Did the inquest go into, for example, the extent of the wound on the skull? Is there anywhere in the proceedings where that was examined and agreed to, that it was not a serious injury?
My Lord, I could not find anything where any of the witnesses, apart from the injuries with scabs, and that was indicated as older than 12 hours, those injuries, apart from those injuries, I did not see in their evidence that any one of them were taken to task as to what other causes might have been, what other factors might have caused the injuries. That I cannot see from the evidence.
But was it dealt with? The question is, was it dealt with? Or was the focus, as Advocate Pretoria says, on the question of the age of the wounds? Because that was my understanding when I read these proceedings, that it looks like the focus, to a very large extent, was on how old the wounds were. The extent of the seriousness of those wounds, we don't know where it's covered, because we are having this other bulk part of the evidence that is missing. Whether that was canvassed with the police, we don't know. But then the report of the doctors here seems to have gone only on the question, or not only, but mostly on the question of the 4 to 6 days or the 6 to 8 days and so on. And it does not mean, therefore, that if the court did not examine or go into whether the injury on the frontal, on the nose, or on the head was serious enough to can cause death. I don't know whether that was canvassed. I didn't pick it up.
I could not find any issue that was taken on that specific issues in the cross-examination.
Then that brings me to the question I raised earlier. Are you saying to me that I must draw an inference in the absence of that it was therefore agreed that they were not serious? Is that what you want me to find?
Not that they are not serious.
Yes, because that's the debate here.
But then it deals with the fact that their observation of the wounds were as described in Dr. Skeper's report.
Absolutely. They gave their opinions based on what was described, and that's what she's doing. She's basing her opinion on the post-mortem report, right? Now, I'm saying to you, if you point out to me here in the proceedings where it was stated categorically that the injuries were not of a serious nature, I would then say that you are within your right to can raise that debate with her. But in the absence of that, you want me to assume things that are not in evidence.
My Lord, with respect, it is not whether or not the injuries are serious or not. The issue which I raise is that what the evidence of the witness currently is that certain injuries that she identified is inconsistent with the fall. And that is the issue that I take, my Lord, is that none of these two experts that testified and that were present at the actual post-mortem investigation, either in a report or in their evidence in court, give any indication that from their observation, these injuries, let's deal with the depressed skull injury, for example, was not caused by the fall.
No. I don't think you understood it correctly. The mere fact that there was a debate about the age of the wounds in itself tells you that there was a discussion whether there were wounds before the fall. Right?
Yes.
That's what they both conceded.
Yes, that's concession.
Yes, they conceded, both of them, Skeppers and Blackman, that there were wounds, even Koch.
Yes.
But then Koch put the time of the infliction of those wounds to be a couple of days before their arrest. Right?
Yes.
And the other two were saying, no, it's 4 to 6. They were within that region. But that debate was based on the acceptance that there were wounds that are not consistent with the fall. That's my understanding. I don't know.
Yes, that is how I'm middle.
Yes. Now, the point you're making, I'm not quite sure now.
I'm specifically making this point with regard to the depressed skull fracture, for example, which seems to be a very serious point taken by the witness, because in fact it is a serious point.
Yes, it is.
And her evidence is that that is not what one would have expected from a high fall injury.
Yes, that's what she's saying.
And that is what I'm saying to her. I have studied the report of Dr. Skeepers. I've also read their evidence in court, and nowhere there do I see that there is a differentiation made specifically there with the depressed skull injury. That was not considered to be caused by the fall.
Let's handle it this way, counsel. She hasn't read the trial proceedings. You and I have read the trial proceedings. You have put it to her. She told you she hasn't read the trial proceedings. So she has given an evidence based on what she has studied on the postmortem. You'll argue that point at the end. I think let's leave it on that basis. You'll argue it with reference to the evidence here in detail. Yes.
Thank you.
Pass on to the next question here.
Thank you, my Lord. Then, if I can take you to page 16 of your report on page 150, paginated. This is basically from there onwards and later up to page 18 of your report, where you specifically deal with why you say these injuries are not associated with a fall. If I can get to your culmination of your opinion there on page 18, specifically your third bullet point there, where you say the multiple facial fractures do not appear to be related. Do you exclude them as being related, or do you say what specifically do you mean by do not appear? Do you exclude that they are definitely not related to the fall?
So, my Lord, we are very careful in our terminology, and we say that something is consistent with or not consistent with. So, in this particular case, the injuries that I've documented that I say are not consistent with a fall from a height is exactly what I mean, is that they are not consistent with a fall from a height.
The structure on which the deceased fell, and we understand that there were some shrubs. I don't think we know the nature of the shrubs, whether it was hard shrubs, soft shrubs. Would that have made a difference?
My Lord, if I can just refer you back to page 17 of my report. It does go into the question, I think, related to the injuries of the face. And basically says that if the face was one of the points of impact from the fall from a height, a greater severity of injuries would be expected, and the injuries would commonly be associated with other blunt force injuries like lacerations and abrasions. So the isolated facial fractures are not consistent with a fall from a height. So that would actually be whether or not there was a shrub present or in the path of the fall or not. It would just mean that if the face was an impact, if the face was an area of impact during the fall, you would have expected a different nature of injuries in that area. Whether the impact was against a shrub or against the ground, you would have expected a different nature.
And the depressed skull, which you refer to in the next bullet point, in fact you say it is rare for a fall from that height. Does that mean that it is excluded? Is it in a similar vein as you have explained the facial injuries? It's inconsistent, but it might have occurred, if I understand your wording of rare.
So, my Lord, generally because I showed you the area of the impact. So you would have to expect that during the mechanism, so as the body or the body is falling from a height, there would be some sort of blunt force that would impact the body to such an extent where the top of the head would receive a direct force from a blunt object. So is it completely impossible in a fall from a height? No, it is not. But in this particular case, it's rare to be seen, and it's not consistent with the other types of injuries that were found on the body. And if I can just come back to my original statement, it is about patterns of injuries, injury patterns. So you would expect to see certain injury patterns in certain scenarios. So the thing that was very clear was that certain injuries did not fit the pattern. Hence, they were not consistent.
Thank you. And would it have made a difference if in the fall the deceased were hit by anything else? For example, I don't know whether there are ledges. We have not yet heard the evidence of the trajectory. Whether if he should fall, and he should fall, for example, on a balcony or an extended portion on a ledge or something like that, would that have changed the nature and what you have expected?
So, my lord, that is possible. So if the deceased had fallen, so with the head in this position, head down, and because, I mean, it couldn't be head up, so head down, and a ledge or some sort of projection from the building that had sufficient amount of blunt force impacted that particular area of the skull, it would be possible. But in my opinion, it's unlikely.
Thank you. You want to have any further questions?
My lord, just one question on re-examination, if I may.
Yes.
And my lord, just for the record and an argument, we will be pointing you to at least one reference, and we will look for more in the record of the original transcript of the first inquest, where Dr. Gluckman does not exclude fractures arising from non-fall injuries. Doctor, if you were to consider Dr. Skepa's post-mortem report and, of course, when it was finalized back in the early 1970s, would you describe it as a model of perfection?
My lord, there's a number of things that I would have done differently. I did find that the measurement and the description of the wounds was not very good. I would have expected a few more descriptive identifiers in each of the wounds based on the way I do my reports. However, it was an adequate report. I mean, it documented adequately all the post-mortem findings. Could it have been better? Yes, it could have. And I just think that it was adequate for the case.
No further questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Doctor, for your testimony. It was a deep lecture, and I'm not sure whether you gave us the scope for the examination, but it was a deep lecture. In reality, it helped me understand some of these medical terms that were used here. Thank you very much for your assistance. You're excused now.
It's my pleasure, my lord.
Yes. Are we having the next witness?
My lord, we do have one for the witness for today, and that's Dr. Steve Naidu. But since we're approaching lunchtime, perhaps this might be a good time to take the matter, gentlemen.
Yes. And how long is this evidence? Are we going to take the whole?
I would think that it wouldn't take any longer than the evidence of Dr. Holland. But it could take the better part of the afternoon.
Because tomorrow we have that other motion, so it might mean that we proceed even tomorrow on it if we cannot get through it today. Just try to think about that.
Yes, so Dr. Woodley, unless I'm remembering you correctly, is coming on Friday morning. Tomorrow in the morning we have the author John Vorster.
Before then, there's this issue of Mr. Thompson, which might take a while because I'd like to hear all of you on it. I take it you are preparing.
Yes,
Even though I don't have a formal application before me, I just have heads of argument, and I don't know what the application is really. But we'll have to hear what Mr. Thompson is going to say.
we will have written submissions ready for your Lordship.
Yes, I would have thought that the application should precede the heads, but I don't have an application before me, and I don't know what to do with it anyway. But it's just the heads of argument. What is worth, you will prepare on that.
Yes, indeed.
Yes, I don't know how long it's going to take us to argue that, so I want you to factor that in as well when you look at the question of witnesses tomorrow.
We will do so.
Yes. Okay, we are adjourned until 2 o'clock. We should make it fair.
All right.
I get on